March 6, 1944. 1,147 hours. 28,000 feet above the Brandenburg countryside, 40 miles southwest of Berlin. The air is thin and brutally cold at this altitude, cold enough to freeze moisture in a man's nostrils, cold enough to turn instrument dials brittle and sluggish. Through the scratched plexiglass of his cockpit canopy, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 scans the sky with practiced efficiency, searching for the familiar shapes of American heavy bombers, the massive four-engine B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that have been pounding German cities for months. Stigler is a veteran, an ace with 28 confirmed kills, and he knows the patterns of these raids by heart. The bombers come in huge formations, bristling with defensive guns, protected for part of their journey by twin-engine P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt escorts. But those escorts always turn back somewhere over western Germany, their fuel exhausted, their range depleted. Beyond that invisible line, a line the Luftwaffe pilots call the Escort barrier, the bombers are vulnerable, and the German fighters swarm like wolves upon unprotected sheep. Stigler expects today to be no different. His squadron has been scrambled to intercept a formation of B-17s targeting Berlin's ball-bearing plants, and intelligence reports indicate the American escorts turned back 15 minutes ago over Brunswick. The bombers, according to all doctrine and experience, should now be alone. But as Stigler climbs toward the bomber stream, something catches his eye, a glint of reflected sunlight high and to the east, moving fast. He squints, adjusts his oxygen mask, and then his breath catches. There, above the bombers, weaving in loose defensive formations, are single-engine fighters. Sleek, angular, unmistakable. North American P-51 Mustangs. Over Berlin. Stigler's radio crackles with confused German voices, other pilots reporting the same impossible sight. The Americans have brought single-engine fighters all the way to the Reich capital, 600 miles from their bases in England. The escort barrier has been shattered. And in that moment, Franz Stigler understands that the rules of the air war have fundamentally changed. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany began in earnest in 1942, when the United States Army Air Forces joined the British Royal Air Force in a coordinated effort to destroy German industrial capacity and break civilian morale. The British bombed by night, carpet-bombing cities with incendiaries and high explosives. The Americans bombed by day, using precision tactics to target factories, refineries, rail yards, and military installations. The American approach required heavy bombers to penetrate deep into German-controlled airspace in daylight, making them vulnerable to fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. The B-17 and B-24 were formidable machines, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and still reaching their targets. But they were slow, flying at speeds between 180 and 200 miles per hour at altitude, and despite their defensive armament, they could not survive sustained fighter attacks without escort protection. The problem was range. In 1943, American fighter aircraft, the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt, could escort bombers only as far as western Germany before their fuel tanks ran dry and they were forced to turn back. Beyond that point, the bombers were on their own, and German fighters exacted a terrible toll. On August 17, 1943, during the raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, 60 B-17s were shot down out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16%. Another mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, saw 60 more bombers destroyed. These losses were unsustainable. Bomber crews called the missions beyond escort range coffin corners, and survival rates for those completing a 25 mission tour dropped below 50%. The 8th Air Force faced a strategic crisis. Without long-range fighter escorts, daylight precision bombing could not continue. The air war was being lost. The P-51 Mustang was not originally designed to solve this problem. The aircraft was conceived in 1940 as a fighter for the British Royal Air Force, designed and built by North American Aviation in an astonishing 102 days. Early models, powered by Allison engines, were fast at low altitude but underpowered at the high altitudes where bomber escort missions were flown. The British used them primarily for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance. But in 1942, a British test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang and recognized its potential. He suggested mating the Mustang's aerodynamically efficient airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that propelled the legendary Spitfire. The result was transformative. The P-51B, equipped with the Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine, could fly at 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, making it one of the fastest fighters in the world. But speed was only part of the equation. The Mustang's laminar flow wing design, thin, smooth, optimized for low drag, gave it extraordinary fuel efficiency. With internal tanks and 2 external drop tanks, the P-51B could fly over 1,600 miles, enough range to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. No other single-engine fighter in the world possessed this combination of speed, maneuverability, and range. When the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England in late 1943 and were assigned to the 8th Air Force's fighter groups, they were initially met with skepticism by pilots accustomed to the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts. The Mustang looked fragile, with its liquid-cooled engine vulnerable to battle damage. But those who flew it quickly recognized its qualities. It could outrun, outclimb, and outturn the Luftwaffe's best fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. And it could do so over Berlin. The German High Command did not believe the initial reports. When Luftwaffe fighter controllers radioed warnings on March 4, 1944, that American single-engine fighters had been sighted over central Germany, the information was dismissed as misidentification or exaggeration. The Reich Air Ministry's intelligence assessments, based on captured aircraft and technical analysis, concluded that no Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach beyond the Ruhr Valley. General Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, had built his defensive strategy around this assumption. German fighters were concentrated in zones beyond the range of American escorts, where they could mass against the bomber streams without interference. The arrival of the P-51 over the heart of Germany shattered this strategy. Suddenly, nowhere in the Reich was safe. Luftwaffe fighters, which had enjoyed a period of relative freedom attacking unescorted bombers, now found themselves engaged by a fighter superior in almost every performance metric. German pilots, many of them veterans of years of combat over Europe and the Eastern Front, struggled to adapt. The Mustang could dictate the terms of engagement, diving out of the sun, attacking at high speed, disengaging before the slower German fighters could respond. Luftwaffe loss rates began to decline dramatically. In February 1944, before the P-51 was deployed in large numbers, the Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters. In March, that number rose to 489. In April, 697. And in May 1944, the month before D-Day, German fighter losses reached 970 aircraft, including 750 pilots killed or missing. The Luftwaffe was being bled to death, and there was no solution. The emotional contrast at the heart of this story is the collision between German confidence and American innovation, between the expected invulnerability of the Reich's airspace and the sudden, disorienting reality of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin. Luftwaffe pilots in early 1944 still believed in their qualitative superiority. They flew excellent aircraft, The Bf-109G and FW-190A were formidable fighters by any measure, and many had combat experience stretching back to the Battle of Britain, the Mediterranean, or the Eastern Front. They had developed tactics specifically optimized for attacking heavy bombers, high-speed head-on passes to disrupt formations, attacks from the rear and below where defensive fire was weakest, coordinated assaults using rocket-armed fighters to break up the boxes before conventional fighters closed in. These tactics worked, devastatingly, against unescorted bombers. But they assumed the bombers would be unescorted over Germany, and that assumption was the foundation upon which the entire Reich air defense system rested. When the P-51s appeared, the foundation crumbled. German pilots found themselves fighting not just to shoot down bombers, but to survive against an enemy fighter that could engage them on equal or superior terms. The psychological impact was profound. A Luftwaffe pilot named Heinz Nock, who flew more than 400 missions and recorded his experiences in a diary later published as "I flew for the Fuhrer," wrote on March 8, 1944. "Today we encountered American single-engine fighters over Hanover. They were Mustangs, and they chased us across the sky like we were training novices. They are faster than our 109s, more maneuverable than we expected, and they are everywhere. Where did they come from? How can they reach so far? Our intelligence told us this was impossible. We have been deceived, or the Americans have worked a miracle. Either way, we are in grave danger." The historical evidence documenting the impact of the P-51 Mustang on the air war is extensive and unambiguous. United States Strategic Bombing Survey data, compiled after the war, shows that German aircraft production actually increased throughout 1944 despite relentless bombing, dispersal of factories, and underground production kept new fighters rolling off assembly lines. But production was meaningless if the Luftwaffe could not keep its pilots alive long enough to fly them. In the 6 months before the P-51's widespread deployment, the Luftwaffe's monthly pilot loss rate averaged 15% of operational strength, painful but sustainable with training programs at full capacity. After March 1944, that rate doubled, reaching 30% in some months. Pilot training programs, already strained by fuel shortages and the diversion of instructors to combat units, could not replace losses at this pace. New pilots arrived at fighter squadrons with as little as 30 hours in type, compared to the 200 hours that pre-war pilots received. They were thrown into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft, and they died in staggering numbers. A German fighter pilot's average life expectancy in combat dropped from several months in 1943 to mere weeks by the summer of 1944. General Galland wrote in his post-war memoir, "The appearance of the Mustang over Germany was the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. We could no longer concentrate our forces against the bombers. We had to defend ourselves against the escorts, and in doing so, we bled away our strength. By June 1944, we had lost air superiority over our own country." The symbolic object of this story is the drop tank, a streamlined, disposable fuel tank attached beneath the wings or fuselage of the P-51 Mustang. These tanks, made of pressed paper or aluminum, held between 75 and 110 gallons of fuel. They were simple, inexpensive, almost crude in their construction. But they were also revolutionary. The drop tank allowed the Mustang to carry enough fuel to reach Berlin and still have reserves for combat and the return journey. When empty, or when combat was imminent, the pilot could jettison the tanks with the flip of a switch, reducing drag and weight to restore the aircraft's full performance. The drop tank becomes, in this narrative, the symbol of American industrial ingenuity and logistical thinking. It represents the recognition that wars are won not just by building better weapons, but by solving the systemic problems that prevent those weapons from being used effectively. The Germans had built excellent fighters, But they had not solved the problem of fuel supply. By 1944, gasoline shortages were crippling training and operations. The Americans had built a good fighter and then extended its reach with a disposable fuel tank, transforming it into a war-winning weapon. The drop tank, humble and unglamorous, was as important to the outcome of the air war as the Merlin engine or the laminar flow wing. March 6, 1944. The same afternoon, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler closes on a formation of B-17s, intending to attack from their vulnerable belly position. But before he can position his Bf-109 for the attack run, tracers flash past his canopy. Bright, terrifying streaks of .50 caliber fire. A P-51 has bounced him from above, diving out of the sun, the classic fighter attack that he himself has executed 100 times. Stigler brakes hard right, pulling maximum G-force, the horizon spinning, his vision narrowing as blood drains from his head. The Mustang follows, staying on his tail, firing in short, precise bursts. Stigler jettisons his external fuel tank to reduce weight and drag, then pushes the throttle to emergency power. His 109 accelerates, but not fast enough. The Mustang stays with him, closing the distance. Stigler rolls inverted and dives, a desperate maneuver to use gravity and his fighter's superior dive characteristics to escape. The ground rushes up, 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The Mustang is still behind him. At 5,000 feet, Stigler pulls out of the dive with brutal force, the aircraft shuddering under the strain, rivets creaking. He levels out barely 1,000 feet above the fields and forests of Brandenburg. When he looks back, the Mustang is gone, probably broken off to preserve fuel for the return journey. Stigler is alive, but he has failed to engage the bombers. He has been driven from the sky by an American fighter that, according to all the intelligence briefings he has received, should not exist this far from England. The transformation that occurred in the spring of 1944 was not merely tactical but philosophical. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine around the concept of local air superiority, concentrating fighters at decisive points to overwhelm enemy bombers, accepting that some areas would be lightly defended, trusting that the enemy's limited range would prevent him from exploiting those weaknesses. This was a doctrine born of limited resources, of a Germany stretched thin across multiple fronts, unable to defend everywhere simultaneously. It worked, as long as the enemy's limitations matched German expectations. The P-51 removed those limitations. American bombers, escorted by Mustangs, could now strike anywhere in Germany at any time. The Luftwaffe could no longer choose where to fight. It was forced to react, to scramble fighters in response to raids, to spread its forces thin in a futile attempt to cover all possible targets. And in a war of attrition, where the Americans could replace losses faster than Germany could, this was a losing strategy. German pilots understood this before their commanders did. They saw the Mustangs multiplying, first a few dozen, then hundreds, eventually thousands. They saw their friends disappearing, shot down or missing, replaced by teenagers with minimal training. They saw fuel shortages grounding entire Gruppen, saw maintenance crews cannibalizing parts from wrecked aircraft because new spares were not available. And they understood that the war in the air was being lost. The American perspective was triumphant but sobering. P-51 pilots, many of them fresh from training in the United States, found themselves in a shooting gallery. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend, could not avoid combat. German fighters rose to meet every bomber stream, and the Mustangs met them. Major John T. Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group recalled in a post-war interview, "The first time I escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back, I couldn't believe we'd actually done it. We'd flown 600 miles into Germany, fought the Luftwaffe over their own capital, and come home. The German pilots we fought were brave, skilled, desperate. But they couldn't run. They had to defend their cities, their factories, and we could hunt them down wherever they went. It was slaughter, and I took no joy in it. But it was necessary. The cost to American bomber crews, though still significant, dropped dramatically. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 299 bombers. In April, after the P-51 achieved full operational deployment, losses dropped to 190 despite an increase in the number of missions flown. By June, losses fell to 129. The difference was the Mustang. Bomber crews, who had watched the earlier P-38 and P-47 escorts turn back at the German border, leaving them to face the Luftwaffe alone, now saw the distinctive profile of the P-51 staying with them all the way to the target and back. They called the Mustang pilots "little friends," and the gratitude was profound and genuine. April 1944. The air war enters a new phase. The 8th Air Force launches Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, a series of massive raids targeting German aircraft production facilities. Over 6 days, American bombers fly more than 3,000 sorties, escorted by Mustangs that engaged the Luftwaffe in large-scale battles over the heart of Germany. Luftwaffe losses are catastrophic. 355 fighters shot down, 165 pilots killed, many more wounded or captured. American losses are significant, 226 bombers and 28 fighters, but the exchange ratio is decisively in favor of the Americans. German aircraft production, despite dispersal efforts, is disrupted. More importantly, the pool of experienced Luftwaffe pilots is drained beyond recovery. Jagdgeschwader units that had been elite formations with decades of collective combat experience are decimated. Replacements arrive with barely enough training to take off and land, let alone engage in complex aerial combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. The Luftwaffe begins a death spiral from which it will never recover. The drop tank, that simple cylindrical container of fuel, is jettisoned by the thousands over Germany in the spring of 1944. They fall into fields and forests, into rivers and villages, empty shells tumbling through the air. German civilians collect them, melt them down for scrap metal, use them as water containers or makeshift storage. They become a symbol, for the German people, of American material abundance. The enemy can afford to throw away fuel tanks, to discard resources casually, while Germany hoards and rations and scrapes to keep its own aircraft flying. This contrast is not lost on the Luftwaffe pilots. They see the Mustangs arriving in ever greater numbers, always with full ammunition and fuel, always with reinforcements. Meanwhile, German fighter units are grounded for lack of fuel. Their aircraft sit idle for want of spare parts. Their pilots fly obsolete machines because production of newer models has been delayed. The psychological impact of this disparity is corrosive. German pilots begin to doubt not their own courage or skill, but the competence of their leadership, the honesty of their propaganda, the sustainability of the war itself. May 1944. Franz Stigler sits in the pilot-ready room at an airfield near Munich, waiting for the scramble alarm that he knows will come. He is exhausted, flying 3 or 4 missions a day when fuel is available, sleeping in his flight suit, eating cold rations between sorties. Around him, other pilots wait in silence. The camaraderie of earlier years has been replaced by a grim fatalism. New pilots arrive, wide-eyed and nervous, and are dead within days. The veterans, the survivors, have become hollow-eyed and silent, conserving energy, calculating odds. Stigler has shot down 31 aircraft now, but the victories bring no satisfaction. For every bomber he damages or destroys, 10 more appear. For every Mustang driven off, 5 more take its place. The alarm sounds. Stigler and the others run to their aircraft. He straps into the cockpit of his Bf-109, starts the engine, and taxis to the runway. As he climbs toward the bomber stream, he sees them again, the Mustangs, silver specks against the blue sky, circling high above the bombers like birds of prey. He knows, with cold certainty, that some of the men in his squadron will not return. He knows that the war is lost, even if the official propaganda denies it. And he knows that the drop tanks falling from those Mustangs represent something Germany can never match. An enemy with resources so vast that waste is irrelevant. An enemy that can afford to fight a war of attrition and win. The historical record shows that the P-51 Mustang destroyed more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other Allied fighter, 4,950 confirmed kills, according to USAF records. But the Mustang's strategic impact extended far beyond kills. It forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. It allowed American bombers to strike the full depth of German territory, destroying infrastructure, disrupting production, and demoralizing the civilian population. It cleared the skies over France in preparation for D-Day, ensuring that Allied ground forces would not face significant air attack during the critical invasion phase. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, stated in his post-war memoir, "The long-range escort fighter was the key to our air superiority over Germany. Without it, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed, and the invasion of France would have been far more costly, perhaps even impossible." The P-51 Mustang, more than any other single weapon, made victory in Europe achievable. The transformation of the air war was complete by June 1944. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, they did so under near-total air superiority. The Luftwaffe managed only minor, ineffective sorties against the invasion beaches. German ground forces, accustomed to the support of their own air power and the terror it inspired in their enemies, now experienced what Allied forces had endured in 1940 and 1941, the helpless vulnerability of being attacked from the air without possibility of reply. German soldiers called Allied fighter bombers J-bows, Jagbomber, and they feared them more than artillery. The P-51, having won the air war over Germany, now roamed freely over France, strafing convoys, attacking trains, destroying bridges, interdicting supplies. The Mustang had become not just an escort fighter, but a complete air superiority weapon, capable of fulfilling every mission from bomber protection to ground attack. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was reduced to impotence. June 1944. Franz Stigler, now promoted to Hauptmann and commanding a staffel of Bf 109s, leads his fighters against a raid on Munich. The bombers are there, as always, in their massive formations. And the Mustangs are there, as always, weaving above and around the bombers. Stigler's squadron attacks, and the Mustangs dive to intercept. Within seconds, the sky is full of turning, twisting, diving aircraft, tracer fire arcing in every direction, the roar of engines, and the chatter of machine guns. Stigler shoots down a straggling B-17, sees it falling trailing smoke, sees the crew bailing out. Then a Mustang is on him, firing. He brakes, climbs, dives, tries every maneuver he knows. The Mustang stays with him. Stigler realizes, with a strange detachment, that the American pilot is better than he is, younger, fresher, less exhausted, flying a better aircraft. Stigler's 109 shudders as bullets punch through the wing. He smells glycol, sees the temperature gauge climbing. His engine has been hit. He cuts the throttle, jettisons the canopy, and bails out. As he falls through the air, parachute deploying above him, he watches the Mustang circle once, the pilot checking to ensure Stigler has successfully evacuated, then turn and dive back toward the bombers. Professional courtesy, even in total war. Stigler lands in a farmer's field and watches the contrails above as the battle continues without him. He is alive, but he is finished. His war is over. The epilogue of this story is written in the contrails that marked the sky over Germany in 1944, long white streaks that stretched from England to Berlin and beyond, visible evidence of the air armada that passed overhead daily, bombing, fighting, destroying. German civilians looked up at those contrails and understood that the war was coming to them, that the Reich's borders could no longer protect them, that the promise of invincibility had been a lie. The contrails were drawn by engines burning high-octane fuel carried in drop tanks, those disposable symbols of American abundance. Each tank represented resources that Germany could not match, not just the fuel itself, but the industrial capacity to manufacture thousands of tanks, the logistical system to transport them across the Atlantic, the operational doctrine to use them effectively. The drop tank was a manifestation of a larger truth, that America's strength lay not in individual brilliance or tactical genius, but in systemic efficiency, in the ability to mobilize resources on a scale that enemies could not comprehend, let alone counter. The philosophical dimension of this story lies in the contrast between quality and quantity, between the elite and the mass, between the heroic individual and the industrial system. The Luftwaffe represented the former, superbly trained pilots, excellent aircraft, a warrior culture that emphasized skill and bravery. The American Air Forces represented the latter, mass production, systematic training, overwhelming numerical superiority. The P-51 Mustang was the weapon that bridged this divide. It was mass-produced. More than 15,000 were built, but it was also an excellent aircraft, equal or superior to anything Germany produced. It allowed average American pilots to fight on equal terms with veteran German aces, and it allowed good American pilots to dominate. The Mustang democratized air combat, removing the advantages of experience and individual skill that had sustained the Luftwaffe in the war's early years. In a war between a democracy with limitless resources and a dictatorship with limited resources, the outcome was inevitable once the technological gap was closed. September 1944. The Luftwaffe is a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages ground fighters for days at a time. Experienced pilots are dead, captured, or too wounded to fly. New aircraft sit idle for lack of trained pilots to fly them. The P-51 Mustang, now joined by the even more advanced P-51D model with bubble canopy and 6.50 caliber guns, roams German skies at will. American pilots speak of hunting for German fighters, of hoping to encounter opposition that almost never materializes. The air war has become so one-sided that the primary danger to American pilots is not the enemy, but mechanical failure or weather. The 8th Air Force flies missions with bomber losses in the single digits, sometimes zero. The Luftwaffe's last gasps. The introduction of jet-powered Me-262s and rocket-powered Me-163s come too late and in too small numbers to affect the outcome. Germany's cities are systematically destroyed, its infrastructure reduced to rubble, its people starving and demoralized. And above it all, the contrails continue to streak across the sky, carried by Mustangs escorting bombers, a daily reminder of defeat. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang extends beyond the war. After 1945, Mustangs served in air forces around the world, fought in Korea, served as ground attack aircraft in counterinsurgency campaigns, raced at air shows, became beloved by pilots and aviation enthusiasts. But their true legacy is strategic. They prove that range and endurance could be as decisive as speed and firepower, that the bomber would always get through if it had adequate escort, that air superiority was achievable through systematic application of resources rather than individual heroism. The lessons learned from the Mustang's deployment influenced post-war fighter design, leading to aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and eventually the modern air superiority fighters that dominate today's skies. The drop tank, that simple innovation, became standard equipment on every fighter aircraft, a recognition that combat radius is a fundamental determinant of tactical effectiveness. Franz Stigler survived the war. He was not killed in a parachute descent on that June day in 1944, was not shot by vengeful civilians, or captured and mistreated. He spent the final months of the war training new pilots on the few aircraft and fuel supplies remaining, a futile exercise in prolonging the inevitable. After Germany's surrender, he immigrated to Canada, became a successful businessman, and never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences until late in life. In 1990, he was located by an American researcher investigating a famous incident from December 1943, when a German pilot had escorted a badly damaged B-17 out of German airspace rather than shoot it down. That pilot was Stigler. The B-17's pilot, Charlie Brown, had survived and spent decades searching for the German who had spared him. They met, became friends, and spent their remaining years speaking about reconciliation and the humanity that could persist even in total war. When asked about the P-51 Mustang and its impact, Stigler said simply, "It was the aircraft that defeated us. We could not match its range, and we could not produce it in the numbers needed. The moment I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. It was just a matter of time." The final reflection must address what the drop tank and the Mustang represent in the larger narrative of World War II and the ideological struggle it embodied. The war was fought between systems: fascism, democracy, communism, each claiming superiority, each promising victory. The fascist systems, Germany and Japan, emphasized will, discipline, racial superiority, the primacy of the warrior elite. They built excellent weapons and trained superb soldiers, and for a time they won victories that seemed to validate their ideology. But they could not sustain a long war against enemies with superior resources. The democratic systems, primarily the United States and Britain, emphasized production, logistics, systematic organization, and the mobilization of entire societies. They built good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities, trained adequate soldiers in massive numbers, and applied resources with industrial efficiency. The P-51 Mustang, with its drop tanks, was the perfect symbol of this approach. It was not a weapon of individual genius or heroic will. It was a weapon of system and process, of engineering and logistics, of the recognition that wars are won by getting the right tools to the right place at the right time in sufficient numbers. The drop tanks falling into German fields were seeds of defeat, physical evidence that the Reich's ideology of superior will and racial destiny could not overcome the material and organizational superiority of its enemies. The contrails in the sky, those long white streaks that marked the passage of Mustang-escorted bombers over Germany, were the visible manifestation of this truth. They represented the reach of democracy, the ability of free societies to organize themselves, to harness their industrial might, to project power across oceans and continents. The German people, looking up at those contrails, saw the failure of their own system, the exposure of the lies they had been told about Aryan superiority and inevitable victory. The contrails were drawn by engines burning fuel carried in disposable tanks, a casual abundance that fascism, with its hoarding and rationing and desperate expedients, could never match. And in that contrast, between the drop tank and the empty fuel depot, between the Mustang over Berlin and the grounded Messerschmitt, lay the outcome of the war. The story of the P-51 Mustang and the Escort range that changed the war is, in the end, a story about the power of problem-solving, the importance of logistics, and the triumph of systematic thinking over ideological conviction. The Germans built excellent fighters and trained superb pilots, but they could not solve the problem of fuel supply, could not match American production, could not adapt their doctrine fast enough to counter the Mustang's extended range. The Americans identified a critical problem: bomber losses over Germany, and solved it with a combination of aerodynamic design, engine technology, and the simple expedient of disposable fuel tanks. That solution, implemented systematically across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of missions, broke the Luftwaffe and opened Germany to devastation from the air. The drop tank, falling into a Brandenburg field on a spring afternoon in 1944, was not just a piece of discarded metal. It was a message, written in aluminum and high-octane fuel, that the war was over, that ideology could not defeat industry, that will could not overcome logistics, and that the skies over Berlin, once thought inviolable, now belonged to the silver Mustangs and the men who flew them.